Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to today's episode in our Everything Product series. Today we are going to delve into generative AI, one of the hottest topics of the day, of course. I would love to first welcome our expert panelists. Let's start with Joseph. He's the senior solutions architect at AWS and brings more than 22 years of experience. He has been at the forefront of development as well as software architecture. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Then we have Randy. So he works as senior principal solutions architect at AWS. Again, brings more than 23 years of experience through variety of roles. He has done engineering, product management, tech consulting, all of that. And a lot of his current focus is around AI, big data, analytics. Thanks, Randy, for joining. We also have Prakash. Hi, Prakash. So he's working as solutions architect at AWS. Brings in long 19 years of time spent in the industry, being an engineer, consultant, and calls himself cloud evangelist as well. Thanks, Prakash, for joining. Welcome. And finally, yeah, we have Samir Mahajan. Samir, again, brings along 27 years of industry experience, spanning his work in networking, storage, cloud, AI, ML, and currently is a principal architect at GS Lab. Thanks, Samir, for joining us. So yeah, welcome all of you panelists, and thanks again. So yeah, let's get into it. So before we begin, we usually try to get a sense of who all have joined us today. So we're going to put a quick audience poll, just to get that sense. Okay, hopefully we'll get some sense of how many folks are currently working on or very soon planning to work by leveraging Gen AI. Let's see. This should give us a. All right. Okay. So 2/3 we got. They have voted yes. So that's good to know. So we would love to sort of set the context for what we are going to talk. So I'm going to request a couple of the panelists as to how they first of all very broadly look at generative AI. For those of the audience, just to set a broad context. How do you look at it? And maybe if you can mention sort of one thing that excites you the most about generative AI. Right. So maybe why don't we start with Randy, please?
Sure. So I think generative AI to me, it's probably exciting to me personally, just in the sense that it can really automate just a lot of the things that I do day to day that are just kind of boring and repetitive. So, and I think that's where a lot of the customers I work with are starting too, because they're relatively easy, summarizing meeting notes, summarizing long documents that I don't really have time to read, helping me write kind of routine business documents. It doesn't seem like a huge deal, but if you add up all those minutes a day it saves and then multiply that by the number of people in a company, it can be a big impact. And I think to the first part of your question, generative AI to me, without getting too much into the weeds of like the technical definition, how it really differs from other machine learning is just good at things that traditional machine learning wasn't. So it's good at language and reasoning and kind of assembling different pieces of a task together. And that makes it really interesting for a bunch of use cases that weren't really easy to solve before.
Very cool. Very cool. How about you, Samir?
Yeah, so I think the one key thing about generative AI is that it is all about creating new content, right? So this is the first time it is not just about automation, but it's going to help all creative fields like media, entertainment, designers, painters, right? And just like capabilities of summarization that Randy was talking about, it's going to help wide spectrum of fields like healthcare, BFSI, automotive, in addition to obviously the technology.
Right. So the generative part of it, right? That's why it's looking quite exciting. I do agree. So maybe when I throw this question at Joseph, so maybe Joseph, would you also mention maybe a use case to bring out that point in your mind, what speaks to you the most or what excites you the most?
Yeah, so I think, like, to Randy's point, like the versatility, I think is really one of the most exciting pieces of this, where we have models that can generate code, they can generate documents, they can do music. We've seen video, although the video is a little sketchy at the moment. I, like, to Randy's point as well, I've also used it to generate, I'll use it to summarize things and streamline my particular day-to-day. I've used it for like creative purposes, where not to just generate raw content, but to maybe fuel me with ideas. So generate me 10 different ideas for a blog topic that I might want to write. And I start to use those to kind of fuel my own creativity to create my own topics. I thought a really interesting use case was one that I saw from a partner recently, where they showed a demonstration of using Gen AI for regulatory compliance in emails correspondence. So they were basically able to fine-tune a model against certain SEC compliance controls, and then filter email content through it, flag particular content as compliant or non-compliant with particular controls, and then recommend rewrites of how that email could be rewritten in order to maintain compliance. So it provides a lot of different value proposition there, as far as taking some of the manual effort out of the the reviewing process and things like that, but also hedging some of the risk for the business, where if that email would have gone out as written, there could have been fines or penalties or something like that to the business.
Very interesting. So I see that for Randy, it was sort of automation. I mean, of course, there are other aspects which also must be helping, but the salient points, if I were to pick up for Samir, it was the being able to generate new content. For Joseph, it's the sort of the digital assistant or the creative assistant part of it. So coming to Prakash, so I know you also work with a lot of customers, and you see probably some real scenarios as well. So what how do you look at it?
Totally. I agree to all those innovations, what I'm hearing here. One additional thing what I am seeing is also about it accelerates your innovations, and it improves the developers' productivity as well. I have seen, or I have personally witnessed as well, it takes me 10 steps ahead in actually me developing some products or developing some services by leveraging on Gen AI, where before you even have to worry much about what is the semantics or how I have to write the program. And it helps me to focus on what exactly that program has to do or the code has to do. And this is actually accelerating the productivity of developers and then release cycles as well. So just one other thing I am witnessing with Gen AI.
Perfect. So yeah, very interesting, right? So I mean, so we are hearing everything from generating new content all the way to productivity, and of course there is this creative component. And what I'm also almost seeing is it can enhance our creativity that way. So to Joseph's point, so if I'm able to reach certain point, can it fuel me to go much further than that, which is very interesting. Now let's see if if we can peel one more layer and go to the sort of the next point. So what I wanted to sort of ask was, and maybe I'll see who wants to go first. So if you could please take an example of of a product or a use case, and typically how would you go about it, or if you are already doing it, how have you handled it, sort of the the basic thought process, so that we can put the basic building blocks in place. Anybody who wants to pick it up.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll start first. So first thing, I mean, I would like to point out is, like, there is a funnel, right? That funnel is related to the how the model is getting used in developing these applications, right? So at the top level is the large number of model consumers, right, which simply develop an application or host a service based on an existing model. Okay, now if you go down the funnel, there is a middle tier, right, where there are smaller number of model tuners, right, which basically take an existing model, then they fine tune it using existing data or maybe to the liking of their domain, right? And the bottom is a very few model producers, right? I mean, today probably you can count them on your fingers, right? which build a brand new model. Okay, so as an example, like, to this AWS Square, I'm going to preach their own use case of and interesting because it kind of down into how it does it, right? So first of all, like, it's a code generation kind of activity, right? So like at a model consumer level, basically Whisperer has hosted a service in AWS, right? And it also has a plugin that is sitting right in your IDE, right? That is talking to this service and of code generation, right? So part, right? Now this Whisperer is actually trained on a lot of code because it's all about code generation, right? And specifically related to AWS services, right? That is its US, right? So it kind of is already tuned, right? Now, if you go at the bottom layer, right, it's pretty interesting, right? I mean, you are building your own custom model, right? Of course, it is a last resort. And like, mind you, it's very expensive and time consuming. Like the GPT-3 required 4.6 million US dollars, and it took over a month to train, even with thousands of GPUs, right? Now, like GPT-3, for example, has 175 billion parameters, right? These are trainable parameters. Now, to train these parameters, you need like, 20 times as many tokens to train, right? So GPT-3 required like 45 terabyte of data, right? Now, having said that, Whisperer has actually gone beyond AWS Code Whisperer has gone beyond, and it actually uses a proprietary model for giving like this cutting edge experience, right? And this model is different from the well-known GPT-3, GPT-4, or even Amazon's own Titan, right? So, I mean, basically, that is kind of thing that you are looking at, right? You are looking at the highest level being just a consumer of a model, or being a tuner of a model, or like, building your own custom model.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I like your conceptual how you took us through those layers. I remember, Joseph, would you want to go next? I remember you were mentioning that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll give you a little bit of insight into my personal approach. Like when I'm trying to build out a new product or a new idea or something like that, I go through kind of like a backwards approach of trying to convince myself that it's not a good idea. So I start with, why shouldn't I do this? And kind of from, when you're building a Gen AI application or any ML applications, for instance, one of the first steps that you take is this problem a good candidate for ML in general? From there, you go through a kind of like a vetting process of your problem, and can you solve it with traditional programming techniques? Because it's significantly less expensive to write a simple program to do something rather than build, train, deploy models to answer some of these questions. But if you can't, and it ends up being a good candidate for ML, then I start to go through a little bit of kind of cost benefit analysis of, okay, if we are going down the ML route to solve this problem, what benefit does it have to the business? What is it going to provide? Maybe if we can get a rough idea of return on that, of return on investment, of TCO, because you're going to go through some refactoring there of, do I need real time? Do I need batch? Which kind of scenarios work for that? You start to get into model selection a little bit where, okay, how big of a model do I need? Do I need to train a model? Do I need to fine tune a model? Can I use techniques like retrieval augmented generation to augment the responses that are coming out of a model? To kind of understand what this project is potentially going to cost you and what you're going to get out of it. So if you do a lot of that work up front, you'll find that a lot of ideas you kick out because they are not going to provide you the value, or they are not going to provide you, or they can be solved other ways. But then when the few that you have left end up being really good candidates for generating or for using Gen AI or using ML. But when you get to that point and you are going down this Gen AI route now, one of the biggest tips that I have is to not tightly couple your application to a particular model. Build abstraction layers out between your application and the underlying model, because you're seeing day by day these models are evolving. at a pace that we almost can't keep up with at times. So you want to be able to have like the ability to quickly change those things out, because it could give you a competitive advantage where if somebody is tightly coupled and they have to do full refactors of their application to switch out the underlying LLMs, and you can more agilely make those changes, it could be, you know, a way that you can gain an advantage.
Very interesting. You know, I like how you sort of started from the benefits itself and then work backwards. So I think, yeah, it seems to make sense. And then of course you will have a lot of success in communicating with your colleagues and, you know, business side colleagues as well to take it really, you know, ahead, you know, in that journey. How about you, Randy? How do you sort of, you know, technically think about it?
Yeah, I mean, the way I usually approach any ML project is first, I just want to have a really clear sense of the thing I'm trying to answer. And then I look for the simplest possible solution. And this is one area where I think maybe generative AI, there's so many possibilities that sometimes maybe we're trying to apply it to areas where we already have an existing ML tool that would do a really good job, or I think personalization is a great example. You know, I don't think generative AI models are going to replace recommendation engines, but they can certainly augment them and make their output more meaningful to the end user, things like that. Then with generative AI, you know, I usually think about, go through a sequence of, you know, which model do I want to use based on the task I'm looking at? You know, what are the fine tuning techniques I'll need to apply? And again, I usually, there's a range of those, and I usually go for the simplest one first. And then the thing I always like to keep in mind is how am I going to evaluate the results? You know, evaluating the performance of foundation models is a subject of active research right now, and there's not really a fixed answer. So I think it's really important to consider how are we going to evaluate how well this thing is doing, not only during the prototyping phase, but ongoing in production.
Interesting, right? No, I understand. So you brought a good point, right? So or rather both Joseph and you. So then I'll sort of just rephrase it and then throw it to you, Prakash. So do you see when you are sort of, you know, interacting with functions other than, you know, engineers themselves, so let's say any business functions and other colleagues from departments, do you see the value in starting with, you know, with smaller chunks, first sort of trying to prove the value, in a way having that prototyping mindset? Do you sort of approach it like that, or do you have a, I mean, what's your view on it? Yeah, for you, Prakash. Yeah.
So sorry, that's it.
No.
Yeah. So I like the way in which you go the agile mode. So that is where you can innovate and then experiment and then decide what is going to result better. As Randy was also highlighting about, it's all about the results, what you're going to evaluate, and then quickly adapt to the agility, what Giuseppe was also highlighting about. So do not think Gen AI as the hammer to nail all those problems, right? So pick and choose the right model for the right workload, and then evaluate based upon the results what you're seeing. And it is not always the results what you are getting is the one I will be getting for my application. They will vary, and bring in the relevance over there. So evaluate the results and then choose the model which right fits your application's needs are. So that's where the adaptability of your applications to any models is important, and bring in this framework throughout your cycle of adapting to your machine learning models in your product life cycles.
Got it. So so some of you have mentioned, you know, these types of trade-offs, right? So I always have this question that I, you know, like to ask practicing engineers and architects, that, you know, what are some of the trade-offs that you have seen specifically in this area, because we are talking about Gen AI, and maybe if you can even give an example of where you had to sort of choose and see, because that's where really the experience and wisdom kicks in, right? Yeah, maybe, yeah, anybody, Randy, maybe if you want to take that.
Yeah, sure. So I think, again, to me, the fundamental thing about kind of understanding how well models are performing is, you know, traditional ML, we had pretty well-defined metrics for kind of understanding, how well we were grading, image classification or regression scores, things like that. With generative AI, with language models, for example, understanding how well something is doing is almost like grading an essay. It can be very subjective, and it's very hard to come up with a crisp definition of what's good and what's not. There's a few techniques, I've used. There's some public benchmarks you can start with. It's actually possible to use a high quality model to grade the output of another model along different dimensions, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, it's not necessarily that we trust a model to be more or less biased than a person, but it's certainly cheaper and faster to have a model grade output than to get a collection of people to go and grade a huge amount of model output. So I think it's just one of those things. I think this is going to kind of clearly fall into the category of MLOps for generative AI, where model evaluation isn't ever really a solved problem. It's really an ongoing process, and we just have to build that into the way that we're structuring the project.
Correct. Would you say that you brought an interesting point about the the costing of it in a way, right? So I mean, hidden in your explanation. So I'm almost hearing that upfront there is a lot of cost, because there is we are doing the training, there is a lot of data that we are depending on, and of course, as you said, even the evaluation itself is tricky, right? But then when we actually put it to use, and then that's the nice point that you made, that it should start saving me a lot of that human cost, time of actual experts, and the back and forth and all of that. So I think if it starts to so to say, compensate for that and starts to giving you back that lost time or whatever, so then it would be worthwhile, if I may put it that way, to to do all of this exercise. But I like that all four of you sort of somewhere said that, hey, it's an exciting tool, but don't make it as a as Prakash put it, it's not a single hammer and then you just go looking for nails. I like that analogy. So we are going to quickly ask the next poll question to our audience. Let's see what people think. Yeah, we can flash that, please. Yeah.
And maybe while we're doing the poll, like another thing that comes up kind of, especially more so in the early stages of generative AI, was, you had choices around what model you want to use. But then even inside of those, you have a bunch of different flavors of that model, right? You have different parameters, like different numbers of parameters of models. And I think what happened early on in the life cycle was people just chose the largest one, because they figured it was always going to be the best. And now choosing the largest one, the difference between the largest and the smallest versions of these models is pretty significant. The larger models have a lot of hosting costs associated with them because they require a lot of infrastructure. And it's trying to find the smallest model that gives you the best results, not necessarily the best, I guess maybe the most appropriate, and then trying to layer on additional techniques to enrich it. So that's kind of where, the aspect of fine tuning a small model was able to give you better results in certain scenarios than just using the vanilla version of a really large one, or using retrieval augmented generation on a smaller model versus using a large model. So I think evaluating those, and I think kind of to Randy's point a little bit around like starting with the simplest, sometimes even starting with smaller models to begin with, and then kind of saying, okay, well, this small one doesn't really give me exactly what I'm looking for as far as the quality of the outputs, and then grow as necessary. Like give yourself reasons to grow larger rather than starting big and then kind of working your way down.
Okay, so we have the poll results back. So I see that, so maybe there was a little bit of a typo there, but the correct answer is Imagen, the Google AI model. So that first created the cat picture, which wasn't real. Hey, thanks everyone for answering. Cool. So no, I love your point, Joseph. So I think, and it nicely ties back to the sort of the first thought process that you laid out, right? You're really looking at the ROI, what benefit it's going to bring, and not making, so not sort of, drilling a well which is a mile wide and inch deep, but truly first trying to, see what you're getting out of it. So yeah, quite resonate with that. I think Samir, you are nodding. I think, did you have something to add there, in terms of some of the trade-offs or the choices that you make?
Yeah. So I mean, all these were nice points, right? Where there is a trade-off of the size of the model, right? In fact, there is a trade-off of size of the training data, right? And basically, there is also a subtle trade-off of how much intelligence you want in the model and how many resources you can throw at it. So I mean, all these are interesting trade-offs which are kind of brought up by this Gen AI.
True. No, I agree. So also one sort of a question I had was, so when you are choosing, as some of you hinted at, the data to train on, right? So I think capturing that context correctly will already start helping you. Is that correct? Or what do you think? I mean, the type of data that you would choose, and I mean, size is of course one because that directly relates to the cost. But are there considerations that typically you guys like to make in terms of what you are choosing, or how do you make those choices? Or is it a little more of trial and error, and you arrive at that?
Well, from one perspective, one thing that's interesting about generative AI is, with traditional ML, the data acquisition and preparation is a huge, first step, and often sometimes honestly just a roadblock to moving forward. If you're trying to train like a really high quality classifier, you may need, hundreds of thousands of labeled samples, which is hard to acquire. What's interesting, pre-training the foundation models, of course, requires a huge amount of data, but fine-tuning often doesn't. Sometimes you can get really nice fine-tuning results with only, a couple thousand samples. So that makes fine-tuning much more approachable than a traditional training job. That certainly, reduces the barrier to entry for fine-tuning compared to, pre-training from scratch.
Got it. Yeah, if any of you wanted to add on that before I go to the next one. So I see a related question pop up. So we were just discussing about some of these costs, right? So one listener has asked that, do you guys see the cost of using LLMs going down in near future? I know it's probably very broadly phrased, but or how would you parse it and sort of look at it piece by piece as well?
I think it'll happen.
Okay. Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I think certainly the hardware cost curve will start bending down. We hit a point all of a sudden where to run the most advanced models, which are, a couple 100 billion parameters or something, you had to have the latest and greatest GPU hardware, which was very expensive. I think, the hardware will start catching up at some point over the next couple of years, and there'll be advances in different types of, GPU accelerators and things like that. I think we'll also find that, we may hit a point where we don't have to keep building bigger models, right? We may be able to have smaller models that are well suited to particular tasks and can run on less expensive hardware. But yeah, go ahead, Giuseppe.
I was going to say something similar to that. I think that we're gonna end up seeing more specialized models for a task that are much smaller, I think, and then these like networks of models that are going to kind of feed into each other to answer questions. Like you're seeing that with the advent of like agents and things like that, where we're reaching out to APIs, but those agents could also reach out to other large language models that are specifically trained on a particular area. Randy brought up the hardware curve. I think we're making advances in how we optimize things. I think, in traditional IT in general, every new thing always starts out with a lot of brute force. And then we start to develop techniques when we start to hit critical mass on like, what do we have access to? So I think you're seeing a lot of different techniques like LoRa for model training and things like that. And I think you are also seeing kind of LLMs almost as a service starting to come to fruition, where you're paying by the token instead of having to host your own models. That kind of changes the cost dynamic. So it doesn't necessarily always get cheaper. It may get a little different, but I think you'll have options to choose whatever the best one is for your use case.
Got it. As you were explaining, I'm almost thinking like, instead of, so we probably start with a big hammer, and everybody probably has only that, but we may end up with a Swiss knife, right? So there are little models which are much more specific for that task. I don't know if the analogy holds, but that's what I thought of. So while and also to Samir's point earlier, how he was thinking about it, and as well as Joseph's. So somebody has asked that, sort of starting with, are there some default choices that you make, or you truly, I mean, I sort of can gauge what the answer is, but somebody asked that, do you always default to some starting model per se?
Not really. There's no like start here type of thing.
Right.
If you're getting started, probably if somebody who's getting started with Gen AI, you probably start with something that you could run locally on a CPU. So start with smaller stuff. Like I used Flan base Flan T5 base as something that I could just run locally in a Jupyter notebook and not need GPU acceleration. So it allows me to experiment and kind of play around with the processes that are involved in building a Gen AI application, where maybe my outputs aren't the best yet, but it's giving me the experience to get started. And then as I kind of grow in expertise, I'll use maybe more advanced ones or something a little larger. It's more about controlling cost, I think, when you're learning, because it makes it really hard to learn when it's really expensive to learn. So that's probably my best advice for somebody who's getting started.
I like that. Thanks. So, so shifting a gear a little bit, right? So, I mean, what I wanted to ask was, so how are the different tools that AWS has? How do they help creators, developers in in this space? I know we have touched on some of them, but if you wanted to sort of elaborate some of that aspect as well.
You want me to start, Randy, or you want to go?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, just a second.
So I think the tools that AWS is providing, I think it's complement to what Mandar was talking about earlier around like the different layers of the stack. We're providing tools to practitioners at all those different levels. So we have companies like AI21 Labs that are building foundational models using SageMaker. For customers who want to deploy those models and potentially fine tune them and things like that, we have SageMaker Jumpstart that's readily available right now, where you can go and choose through a variety of open source and third-party models to be able to deploy something really quickly. Potentially write some scripts to fine tune those models and start to generate outputs. And then you have the upcoming Amazon Bedrock solution that's going to provide API-based access to those third-party from AI21, from Anthropic, Cohere, Stability, open source models, and then even some Amazon first-party models. So you're going to have a lot of flexibility and kind of increased development velocity, because now you're integrating with APIs. You're not really worried about all the ML ops that are involved with building, deploying, retraining, and all those things. But I think one of the interesting things is how solutions like Bedrock are going to help customers with an area around like data privacy and data security. Bedrock will allow them to fine tune models on their own data without that model becoming available. So when you fine tune a model with Bedrock, you'll be able to copy the base foundation model into your environment, copy or fine tune that copy on your data, and then it's used locally. So Amazon doesn't have any access to that data, which is a really strong area of focus for customers who, data is like, I've heard data is the new oil, data is the new electricity. Like data is really important to customers, and that IP is the crown jewels of most companies. So they want to keep that close. And I think we're meeting customers where they are by providing them the ability to fine tune those models, but also, do it securely and privately.
Great. Good you touched on that, because we actually had a question around, that data leakage and the apprehensions around, really using LLMs because of such fears. But I think, you addressed that well. So coming to Prakash, Prakash, I know you also work on the customer side. So do you see, some of these tools being picked up, more than some others? And I mean, some are popular, and, what's your experience on the field?
So my experience with that is about, again, I'm going back to the use case of which level of services, as GCP was highlighting. If you're looking for something to readily consume based upon what is already available, the LLMs are already available, and all you need to do is take that and then give a few fine-tuning parameters and start using for the workloads. And that's the kind of adoptions I'm seeing lately. And the data security is a key thing. I have to repeat it here because I have been hearing in the public forums as well how the scare on the data leakage is widely variant with the LLMs coming in. Is my data going to be used by your model to train for itself and others can make use of it? So to be straight on that problem, right? Or the situation, what it is. So that is where take the LLM and let the LLM come to your data and work for it. And then you are actually going to have the access to your own data, nobody else. So that is the key thing to secure at the prime most of using any of those LLM services. So I'm seeing that is getting more adaptive. But as Randy was also highlighting, you don't need more LLMs to come in to solve the problem for you. Make use of the one which is already available as a foundation model and leverage on some of the retrieval augment generations like RAG to bring in that relevance and get in that output what we are going to use. That's the trend I am seeing here, and that's the thing I'm seeing around all the POCs running around with the customers what I'm working with.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think it's going to be, as you are rightly saying, it's going to be crucial for the adoption part of it, right? I mean, otherwise, that apprehension always remains. So good. I think so. We were able to address, that question as well.
If I could just add on to that,
Yeah, sure.
I think we talk an awful lot about the models because that's really the fun and exciting part. But if you look at the complete solution, Andreessen Horowitz published a good article on their website about 2-3 months ago. I think it was called the Emerging LLM Application Stack. But they really highlighted all the areas you need to think about to build a complete solution. And the model and where the model is hosted, that's a couple boxes in that picture, but there's 7 or 8 other boxes for things like, if you're using RAG, it's vector databases, it's the data pipeline to get the data into the vector database, it's the MLOps and governance things. And so, I think part of the value AWS offers is if you look at all those areas, we lean on our existing, very rich set of services for ingesting almost any type of data. We have several different types of vector databases. We have a lot of good governance tools, building out some MLOps capabilities. And that's also, of course, where, our partners like you folks, help us with, the complete end-to-end integrated solutions.
Perfect. I agree. So I'm going to, throw the next one to Samir. So Samir, given your experience overall, doing a lot of work in the overall data science area. So, do you have any, striking aspects that you wanted to bring out, in terms of specifically Gen AI?
Yeah. So, I mean, we touched upon a lot of these things, right? So I would like to kind of step back and draw analogy between human intelligence and AI, right? So human intelligence comes from the brain, right, which is made up of neurons, right? Similarly, AI comes from the neural network, right? And a humongous number of trainable parameters that are out there, okay? Now, just like in human, these neurons need to be wired, okay? These parameters in these models that we have need to be trained using quality data, okay? So half of the intelligence is really in your training data, okay? So in fact, there are some efforts that are underway which are improving the quality of this training data. So earlier, Common Crawl was a common data set. Now they are going to a lot of these curated data sets, right? A new data set that is coming up, which is called Pile, which is like 800 terabyte of data set, right? So that is kind of effort going on in the direction of improving the quality of data, right? I mean, I'm just touching upon the data part, kind of coming from the data science background, right? This was one of the questions that you asked, Manda, right? So for example, I want to have training data, and all that I want to know is what is the command that I need to run on my laptop for my thing to get done, okay? So for that, I don't even have to know who's the president of the US, right? So I can kind of, choose my training data. So just like you can choose your training data, as Giuseppe was saying, right? You can even choose a model, right? So these GPT-3 and all these models, right? There are over a couple of 100 gigabytes, right? So they are unmanageable to host even for inferencing, right? But if you head out to Hugging Face, right? I mean, there were questions on what model to choose, right? So if you head out to Hugging Face, there are literally hundreds of or thousands of models out there, right? So the smallest LLM that is out there is even under 15 GB. Okay. So what you can do is you can have some intelligence in your model. You can have some intelligence in your training data, right? You can start off with some base model, like, even this 15 GB LLM, right? And then you incrementally train it with your quality data, adding the intelligence, right? So with that, what you can have is you can have just the intelligence that you want to solve your use case and nothing more. Okay. Now to add to this, like a model and data, right? There are AI orchestration frameworks like LangChain or semantic kernel, right? Which help you interact with these LLMs using components like prompt templates, agents, tools, which are becoming very sophisticated. So what you can do is you can kind of, distribute your intelligence, right? You can put something in your model, something in your data, something in agent, right? Something in your prompt template, right? And kind of you build your solution, right? And this was kind of the trade-off that I was talking about earlier, right? Which is a trade-off between like your resource requirement and required intelligence, right? Which is subtle, and solutions are evolving in that space.
Loved it. Thanks for elaborating. I think it was illuminating to hear all of your points. We are again going to flash our third audience poll. I want to take a gauge of what. I mean, I think some of you have sort of hinted at that, but let's flash the question and see what people have thought about it.
Yeah, there's a question that somebody brought up. Is there a point where we have consumed all currently available data, leading to subsequent incremental model adjustments for the creation of a supermodel? And I think, honestly, we are going to get to a point where we've scraped and scrubbed a lot of what's available. But I think what's even more interesting is that with the advent of Gen AI, there's more Gen AI related content that's being created that will then be scraped. And then you create this kind of like this feedback loop of potentially not great data. It's synthetically generated data that's now going to be used to generate other synthetic data. And depending on the quality of those outputs, I think it can go in a lot of different directions. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to mean when we get there, but I definitely see it coming at some point.
Right. And I think some of the evaluation related stuff that both you and Randy mentioned, I think they will become more and more relevant, because I can imagine scenarios where this sort of a feedback also sort of unfortunately enhances what was lacking, and that so the noise will also go up in a way, right? I mean, because the signal also it doesn't always have to improve. I mean, or rather it won't. It will also amplify the noise, so to say. Okay, all right. So I think most of the attendees think that of course, training the algorithm and evaluating performance is one of the toughest pieces. Of course, I don't think there is probably a right answer, but I wanted to get a gauge of what people think. Thanks for answering that, guys. Right. So I think one very interesting point which all of you sort of touched on was the data leakage and the privacy aspect of it. But I also want to ask you, are there other sort of considerations that you see, whether they are security privacy related or also I would say almost ethics related, which may come up, and as people start to build more and more practical products and put them out in the real world, do you what's your sense of it? Do you see that as becoming more important, and how do you look at it?
There's a couple. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one thing what I am noticing from the developer's productivity side is what if the code being suggested by a Gen AI is the one which is I'm not supposed to use. Maybe it is vulnerable, or maybe it is protected by some license. This is the kind of thing I have to be looking around very cautiously. Am I using the one I'm supposed to use? So bring in that a service or a model that is capable of giving you, considering all those, eliminating those vulnerable codes, and then also bringing in the license protections as per your need. So that's one thing I thought about.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah. Yes, Randy, please.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting areas I've been looking at. One is what are the implications in the agent and tool pattern of having a language model interacting with other systems on a person's behalf? And, for one thing, sometimes the model can give kind of unpredictable instructions. And for another, those downstream systems, whether it's databases or something else, they may not really have been built with this idea that you're having a model interact with them instead of a person directly. So I think initially we should be a little bit conservative and maybe have like reduced permission scopes for models, interacting with systems on a person's behalf. So I think that's an area that's really worth thinking about.
Got it. Good point. Yes.
I think, to me, one of the things that you'll notice, especially when you use foundation models, like vanilla ones, is I forget who made the point, but it was trained on data that's out on the internet effectively, right? Like that's the corpus of data that's been scraped and scrubbed and whatever. And if you've been on the internet is inherently it contains biases, right? And that bias kind of tends to leak into these models because that's just what the data that's been trained on. So I know there's some areas around constitutional AI that's being kind of investigated and researched on to try to build out kind of like ethics inside of the model training processes. When as a customer, when you're looking at, supplying training data to models, whether it's for fine tuning or if you're trying to do your own foundation model, I think it's really important to identify the biases in that base training data, using some service of some kind to do that, so that you can understand what you're introducing, because you may do it unintentionally, or you may have skewed data sets or representation of demographics and things like that in your data sets. So you need to make sure that you're thoroughly kind of like evaluating that. You're monitoring the inputs and the outputs of your models, and even leverage things to gauge like bias and toxicity, and like be able to manipulate either inputs or outputs, because I think a lot of people are worried about the outputs of what the model is outputting, but you also want to worry about the toxicity coming in to reduce the toxicity coming out. There was a data set called real toxicity prompts that I came across that was used to evaluate like Instruct GPT, Llama, one of the Flan models, things like that, is a good way to gauge the types of outputs that you can potentially get out of your model.
In the spirit of, garbage in, garbage out. So bias in, bias
Absolutely.
out. Right? So that's
Bias
what
and bias.
So,
yeah, so you can even use like other models to kind of quantify the toxicity of a particular input or a particular output, and then adjust it kind of on the way in or on the way out. Right.
No, in fact, we have a question which is almost bang on that point. So that person is referring to the biases as well as sometimes lack of consistency in the justice system. So they have taken an example, right? So how would you use those data sets to then train, because at least you have, because in the justice system at least you have some written laws, right? So there is a letter of the law which is there to refer to, right? But then as we all know, humans interpret it, so there is biases creep in, and that's where typically the fights are. So that's a good example. You sort of answered it, some of it, but if any of you wanted to take a shot at that as well. Sort of preventing unfair outcomes when humans are trying to interpret. And so I think what the question is referring to is almost like a monitoring, just like Giuseppe, you were referring at, right? Or hinting at something monitoring which helps remove or at least tone down the biases.
I mean, if you look at a lot of the existing metrics we collect for bias, I think we can reuse. For example, there's a statistic called, I think it's DPDL, difference in proportion for different labels. And essentially what it measures is, if you kind of break up your end user community into two different cohorts, maybe it's the first cohort is people in the 35 to 45 age range, and then there's everybody else. And you kind of look at if you're talking about, say, a regression model or a classification model that's making decisions, you can look at, are those decisions substantially different for that first cohort versus everybody else? And I think we can use some of that same thinking with generative AI, but we'll do it at different points. So for example, with traditional ML, we'll probably look for this during the model training loop, on our test set, and then we'll still collect it and look at it going forward. With generative AI, I think we'll only really be able to look at this when it's in production. We're collecting data with human feedback. So for example, if we have a model that is putting out text output to different people, we may want to look at things like, well, is this model responding differently to different groups of people who are asking essentially the same question? And we'll have to, of course, understand something about the demographics of the people who are asking it. We'll have to have a way to evaluate the answer that the model's giving. And but it won't be quite as clear cut as, well, we're making like a credit decision and it's a yes or no answer. It'll be things like, is the information contained in the model's answer substantially different based on who's asking the question? And I think what's really interesting is that the way you ask the question, can substantially change the output sometimes. And you have to reflect that different people speak in different ways. And it could be based on what's your native language or, what regional dialect you speak. So these are things I think we do need to be sensitive to, but I think we can reuse some of the basic tooling we had to kind of check for bias and model output.
Right. So I'm sensing that, the more powerful the tool, I think it also ends up touching a lot of other aspects which are outside technology or sometimes even outside business, right? So as this interesting question said, it could be, biases in the legal system, or in fact, maybe I can stretch that and think about, uses in education, because I mean, it's a human language based thing. As Giuseppe said, on the internet, there are all kinds of information available. Somebody's trying to, better inform themselves, but they are going to see that bias because that's going to be there. So whether we come up with a better evaluation of it or some kind of a scoring, but I do realize that quickly becomes quite a complex question, because who does that also starts mattering, and without realizing, our biases will show up. Samir, I know you have done some interesting data science AI type of work, also a little bit in the education related, and some couple of social scenarios. What has been, or how do you imagine sort of that evolving, or what sort of a challenge do you see there?
Yeah, so I think, we kind of touched upon a few aspects, right? So one aspect I would like to touch upon is also, so this is like something which is coming up with a new content, right? So now probably we need to kind of, caution it, saying that, hey, this was not generated by a human, right? Because that's where the problem starts, right? Because then there are, for example, you can ask a model and say, draw a picture of something like Picasso, right? Now, but we have to kind of tell people it's not done by Picasso, right? Because then there will be all these issues that we see today of this copyright infringement and all that, right? There are people suing all over, saying that some artists saying you cannot use my data to train your model, right? Because they know that, hey, from that data comes the intelligence, and that goes out of the model, right? So those will be also some of the important parts, right? For example, even Prakash also mentioned, right? For example, and I'm sure even companies Amazon, Microsoft are now sort of backing the developers, saying that, hey, this code is not like a licensing infringement, or this is not a copyright infringement. It was actually developed working with us, working with Code Whisperer and things like that, right? Because those will be like, some new models of legality and maybe a different perspective at looking at things, which can potentially be sort of controversial.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting, right? So we will, I think, go through that whole curve, that we will excitedly use it, and then again a little bit contextualize it, have to tone it down, make it relevant. And I liked Giuseppe's analogy about it, right? Don't make it a big bang, just truly focus on whether it solves that problem at hand or not. Yeah, so I think lovely comments from on the ethical aspects as well. Do you any point that either Prakash or Giuseppe you wanted to make?
I think it's just the gist of the message is really, the adage, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think we really need to make sure that we are wielding the power that these tools provide responsibly. Leveraging human feedback and things like that are going to be really important ways of kind of introducing the human element and trying to reduce the skew and the bias in some of our responses. And making sure that we do our due diligence to make sure that we're putting in safeguards into our applications of both the inputs and the outputs, like I was talking about earlier, because we want our customers to be able to use these applications that we create that leverage generative AI, but we owe it to them to be responsible in the way that we create content. So just think about that when you're developing applications as well. How can these outputs potentially affect my customers? Have I done my due diligence to make sure that the outputs that I'm creating are appropriate, safe, and applicable?
Right. I think the transparency is going to be key, right? So being forthright about it and truly testing it out in real scenarios and gaining some real feedback. Yes, Prakash.
Amazing points what Giuseppe and Randy brought in. One thing I just want to double click on that is these guardrails or the kind of bias what you're seeing. Don't think those are all the frictions on adapting to the Gen AI. Right? These are all the controls that you get. And sometimes you can actually make use of that to work for you as well. Consider some of those scenarios where a particular cohort is getting a different type of a response versus another cohorts. And you can actually evaluate and see if that is the kind of an experience you want to give it to your customers. So some of them asking for some products from a different region of the world, they may ask that question differently than the other part of the world. So the same response might not be able to, be interpreted rightly. So think of that bias there and make use of that to improve your customer experience as well. Right. So in short, right, these are all not frictions to adapting these technologies, but these are all the controls and the opportunities for you to serve your customers better.
Right. I liked your phrasing of, so not necessarily constraints and bottlenecks, but more like guardrails and helping you do it. Yeah. So last any last comment by Randy, please. Maybe I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think overall, I would just encourage people to, I think generative AI, it's got a lot of buzz. People are now looking at prototypes, moving things into production, thinking about with their roadmap for next year. People, there will be challenges along the way, whether it's integration or, governance or whatever. I would just encourage people, stick with it, concentrate on the use cases that are relatively approachable and have some clear payoff. Yeah, I really do believe this is a transformative technology. It may be a little bit unclear immediately how we apply it across the business, but I think this is one of those trends you definitely don't want to get left behind on.
Perfect. So well put. What a note to end on. Hey, thanks all of our expert panelists for being there today. Thanks everyone for attending. Before we close, we are literally at the last minute. I want to say that we have been running this series called Everything Products. All the previous episodes are there for folks to view. We have touched on all kinds of aspects of product engineering, including UX, and in different domains as well, including healthcare. So I think we have sent the link to those videos to everybody. So please check it out. And thanks for attending and being with us today. Thanks all of our panelists again, and lovely to have you in our series. Have a good day ahead and good night for those who are here in this time zone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.